Hi, and welcome to this live reading from Queen's Destiny, Book 1 by Barb Jones. And this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Prologue, The Prophecy. Sidon, Phoenicia, 1129 BC. Eshmanazar leaned back in his chair and studied the gray outlines where masonry had covered the open windows of his study. He watched the candlelight cast shadows on the rock and reached for his little brazier. The sun hadn't shone through those windows in 83 years. He lit his incense with one of the candles inside. The child would be there soon, smuggled into port in one of the many ships the small community within these walls controlled through various daylight entities. Abibal had been insistent. Ashman, the child is most certainly the one the stars foretold. He recalled the look on Abby's face. Excitement. It was, on reflection, an interesting and rare occurrence. Prior to that conversation 17 days ago, he hadn't seen him excited in more than a century. In fact, not since Abby's early days when he was coming into his power had Eshman seen more than calculation and sober contemplation in his son's features. It was a welcome change. He cupped his hand and drew smoke to his face, inhaling. The incense, herbs caked in ghee, had come from Crete in one of the boats. The shipping enterprise had been remarkably successful, not only allowing for discreet movement of goods and persons that suited the community's particular needs, but also from a monetary standpoint. Merchants had followed suit, and Sidon was rapidly becoming the most important port in the world. That was fine with Ashman's Azar. More shipments made none worthy of special attention. A knock came at the chamber door. It was a servant offering refreshment. He waved him away. No, child, I'll eat later. As the servant turned to leave, he added, but bring a pot of wine and cups. Abibal will arrive soon with a guest. See that he knows where I am. The young man bowed and mumbled his understanding, and Eshman was again left alone. He thought of the girl. Could it truly be her? Nearly 7 years they had sought for her, this child who would bring a message of great significance, great import. That was the way this astrologer had explained it. Import. He had opened the charts and explained the positions of the stars. A child would bring a message of great import, not just for their community, but also for the scores like it that existed throughout the world. He heard the gates open below and knew that his son had arrived. It would take a moment to open the carriage, which had been locked securely against the sun. The servant appeared a moment later with the wine and reported that Abibal had arrived safely with his guest and would be up presently. Ashman took the pot, dipped a cup, and sipped the wine. His mind was racing, and he checked once more that his parchment and quill were ready and the ink pot full. He drained his cup, wishing not for the first time that wine still affected him and his kind. Finally, he dipped the cup again and sat in his chair. It would do no good to let his son see him nervous. A few moments later, the servant was back. He announced Abby and opened the door to allow him to enter. Abby carried the girl in his arms. She was wrapped in light linen, secured by a clasp at her shoulder and a rope at her waist. She was in Athens, then? Yes, father. Has she spoken? I have heard her myself, father. I believe she spoke in the old tongue. Abby's eyes were wide, and he couldn't suppress a smile. He placed the girl on cushions at the side of the study and stepped back, gesturing for his father to examine her. Eshman studied the girl. She looked about 17 or 18, hair black and curled in the Grecian style. She was slender, almost waifish. Her wrap, he was pretty sure the Greeks called it a stola or perhaps a palla, had bunched at her waist, revealing her legs from ankle to the middle of her thigh. Her legs were shapely, rising smoothly from ankle to knee to thigh. He sighed. The ghosts of memories of the life he had left centuries before haunted him more frequently lately. He looked at her face, the high cheekbones giving way to a smooth jawline right above. He stopped, noticing her throat, long and extended as her head reclined over the cushions. He could hear the blood coursing through the vessels in her neck. How much did you drain her? Only enough to ensure she could cause no difficulty in the journey, father. What else did you learn of her? What is her name? Eshman brushed a stray hair from her brow as he spoke. She was abandoned as a child. Evidently, the Greeks do that. The women at the temple call her Diana. She's a mute except for those times when she speaks the old tongue. The temple women assumed she was some kind of oracle, but none have been able to divine the language. Abby stepped to the wine pot and dipped a cup. Eshman considered the girl again. When did the trances occur? Will we have to wait long? I don't think so, Father. She has yet to be in my presence without going into the trance. Well, then, let us wake her. Eshman walked back to his desk and lifted his quill. Abby smiled and walked to the girl. It's time to wake up, Diana, he said, and turned her head so she faced the ceiling. He brought his hand to his face and bit deeply into his wrist. Holding her head steady, he positioned his wrist over her mouth and watched as blood dripped over it. The Greek's lips parted almost immediately and her tongue flicked out. Abby smiled at his father and put his wrist to her lips. The girl sucked eagerly, and moments later her eyes opened. Abby withdrew his wrist and looked at her. The girl sat up on the cushions, frightened. Her eyes grew wide and she looked around the room nervously. Then her eyes rolled backwards into her head until only the whites showed and she began to speak. It was a harsh, guttural language, more animalistic than human, and Eshman scribbled furiously on the parchment. She spoke for nearly 30 minutes before he put down his quill. Silence her, Abby. Abby bent down and grasped her head. He brought his mouth to her throat and held her tightly as his father watched him feed. Finally, when her heart had stopped, he stood and wiped his mouth. Eshman had finished writing and was reading the words on the scroll. Was it the old tongue, Father? It was. It must be her, son. The human tongue should not be able to form some of the words she said. Abby scanned the document. She said the message twice. You stopped her as she started a third repetition. Was it as the stargazer said? Oh, yes, Eshman said. Of great import. He handed the scroll to his son. Abby took it. Strange symbols he'd only seen in his father's old books were written, but at the bottom, Eshman had translated into Phoenician. He began to read. In the hour of the wolf will come the queen of reconciliation. In the birth of her death, the joining will commence, and great will be the hatred of her words. He looked up. Father, what does this mean? Eshmanazar dipped his cup and took a long swallow. Keep reading, my son. Chapter 1. Approaching. Amber, New York, present day. Amber started to pull her ponytail out of the hairband, but stopped herself, sighed, and stepped away from the mirror. It was her last chance to run in New York, and she was not going on a run with her hair down. She sat on the edge of her bed and pulled on her running shoes, lacing them carefully and tightly. One more run, and tomorrow she would be in Seattle. She stood up and began stretching, reached down to her ankles, gripped them tightly, and felt her calves and thighs gradually loosen. She straightened her body and caught a glance of her desk. It was strange to see it bare, although she used it more as an end table than a desk. The movers would arrive in a few hours to load up all of the possessions she'd accumulated in college and get them started west. It was strange to think the school was over. She'd entered college at 16, and Amber had completed a bachelor's degree in archaeology and a master's degree in cultural anthropology in just over 4 years. Her pacing kept her removed from most of the other students, and she'd opted out of consideration as a valedictorian, though she would have won. She picked up her master's diploma at the dean's office, shook his hand, and called home. Her parents, well, her adopted parents, they'd taken her from the orphanage when she was 9, were proud and insisted she drive the 3.5 hours north to their farm to celebrate. There, she suffered through their embraces and the 9-day flow of neighbors with casseroles and cakes, all coming to see the Stones' girl genius. They bought a cap and gown and snapped pictures one after another. No fewer than 13 boys were introduced or reintroduced, and she politely smiled and laughed on cue. 27 meals, and not even one had her family alone at the table. The Smiths for lunch, the Frosts for supper, the Antons for breakfast. A steady stream of family friends and acquaintances come to gawk and to plan her future. She didn't mind too much, honestly. For the 4 years she was gone, she'd only visited a few times. If her mother hadn't called every Sunday morning, Amber believed they might have talked only once or twice the entire time. She loved her family. Who wouldn't love a couple who had adopted a 9-year-old girl? Kids at the orphanage called the 4th birthday the death day because the chances of adoption past that age disappeared. Not the Stones. They had seen Amber helping with the toddlers and insisted on her. They were good, honest people. Still, after 12 years and countless evidences of their love and affection, she still felt out of place, like a guest at the house rather than a daughter. She'd returned home to find mail waiting for her. 6 schools had already commenced recruitment campaigns to get her into PhD programs, and 14 unsolicited job offers had come within 2 weeks. Headhunters called almost hourly until she finally let all of her calls go to voicemail. In a day, the voicemail was full, and she still hadn't cleared it. The Seattle Museum of Science and History approached her a little differently. An overnight package about the size of a television set had arrived just 4 days ago. Within, she found a human skull, 6 crude flint knives, a bag full of pottery shards, and 8 clay masks. An attached letter indicated that the museum had acquired a collection of nearly 18,000 pieces from 6 digs originating in ancient Macedonia. If she found the task of organizing, cataloging, and analyzing the collection of any interest, a curator position was available to her. In addition, the museum would pay for her tuition, field research requirements, and even her dissertation printing for the PhD program in sociocultural anthropology at the University of Washington, which was prepared to incorporate the curator position into her course of study. A loft apartment, a museum car, and a staff of 5 interns rounded out the package. Inside was a one-way plane ticket for a flight out of Kennedy and a $5,000 check for moving expenses. She hadn't wrestled over the decision. Grasping the skull and studying the pre-mortem fractures on the interior half, she had dialed the museum and accepted, but not before negotiating a 7% higher starting salary just on principle. The flight was tonight at 11:45. After a quick change in Denver, she'd be in Seattle in time for breakfast. One more run then, she thought, and opened the door. The air was cool against her neck, and she imagined the wind targeting her birthmark. She started a slow jog and then quickly ramped up to a fast run. Chloe, Yakima, 1993. Chloe held tightly to her mother's hand, and they walked through the pines. She stepped around the occasional drifts of snow that stubbornly refused to melt even now at the end of March. 6 others walked with them, heading deeper into the woods. Chloe looked at their feet, trying to match the sound of the needles and brush crackling under their boots to each particular step. She concentrated on the sounds. When she was satisfied she could identify each of the walkers by the noise of their footsteps, she turned her attention to their breathing. Her mother was easy, and she recognized the pattern without having to think much about it. The others took a little work. The man ahead and to the right breathed shallowly and regularly, while the one behind them wheezed a little. The woman next to her mother breathed purposefully, and as though every exhalation resulted from conscious intention. The others, "Mommy, stop." Her mother looked down at her, and Chloe began to tug at her arm, pulling her south. "Come on." Her mother looked at the wheezing man, and he nodded, so she allowed Chloe to guide her, and the others followed. In a few minutes, the bubbling of the Yakima River reached Chloe's ears. In 4 or 5 more, the others heard it as well. She pulled her mother through a last copse of trees and stood at the bank, staring at the water. "What is it, honey?" Chloe's mother knelt beside her and studied her face. "The whitefish is about to die." Chloe pointed at the water. "What whitefish, sweetie?" "That one right there." She was still pointing at the water. Her mother followed her finger to the water and squinted, but couldn't make out anything below the ripples of the river. "How is the whitefish going to die, Chloe?" It was the Weezer. He'd walked up to where the girl and her mother stood on the bank. He pointed at the water. "Will another fish come and get it?" Chloe reached out and took the man's hand, still pointing, and lifted it up, pushing it as far as her reach allowed. "The sky will kill it." The man looked up and studied the sky for a while, then turned his attention on Chloe's mother. "Marlene, I'm not sure. She feels intently. I know that. Still, it's not just what? What is it?" Marlene's eyes had grown wide, and she stared at the sky. "Look, Tom." He looked up. It was an eagle, and it circled above the river. Suddenly it dove, and Tom gasped at the speed of the thing. In only a second or so, it was flying back upward, a whitefish in its talons. He looked at Chloe. "You were right. She has the sight." Michael, Brussels, present day. Michael rested his head against the velvet of the coffin and sighed as it was closed. The flight from Brussels would arrive in London in just over 3 hours, and from there he would travel to New York. His agents in America had already completed construction of suitable dwellings in Hartford, New Orleans, Las Vegas, and Seattle, and it was time for him to leave Europe. Not forever, no, nothing could keep him from Bruges, though the city was little more than an amusement park now. Still, he knew the quest was reaching its fruition, and he knew that he would find the Queen on the other side of the Atlantic. It had been good to see Cabos again, despite the old one's constant retelling of stories heard thousands of times, and his insistence on reciting all of the joys that modern-day Bruges had replaced with ills. The finest restaurants served tripe for the tourists now. There's been no good food in Flanders for 400 years. Do you still eat then, Cabos? Michael had asked the question with a sly smirk, but Cabos missed the sarcasm and continued. I tell you, Machiel, there is not a chef left in Flanders. Bruges is dead. Did I tell you I saw a child ask her mother if Goodhouse was where Belle and the Beast lived? He had. He told that story to Michael when he'd visited nearly a decade earlier. There is nothing left in this place for you. Go ahead to America. Find your queen. Soon, I think I shall climb to the top of Haltoran and greet the sunrise. Michael chuckled. Don't you think that's too Flemish? I mean, even for you? Machiel, sometimes you try. What was it Longfellow wrote? In the marketplace of Bruges stands the belfry old and brown, thrice consumed and thrice rebuilded, still it watches o'er the town. There must be a better place to die. Why must youth constantly mock age? Cabos shook his head and then brightened. Do you know I was there when he saw the bell tower? Longfellow, I mean. He was still mourning the death of his wife, a lovely girl. She died in childbirth, I think. I actually considered feeding on him, so sad was he. But as I came behind him, I heard him forming those words. Machiel, I think there may be nothing so profound as the sound of a poet forming verse. Perhaps, Cabos. Why do you call me young? I think next month I shall be 3 centuries old. We are both relics now. Bah! I was 52 when I left my life for this, and that was 300 years before you, a whelp, were born. You have never lost that youth. I think should you live 1,000 more years, you will still be young. The two men had sat in Cabos's parlor, a soft room lushly decorated with ornate furniture he'd acquired over the years. A soft knock and a shy servant reminded Michael of his flight, and Cabos had tugged him warmly before he stepped into the car. Michael was leaving Bruges again. In a half hour, the plane would lift off, and in 2 hours, the sun would rise. Michael closed his eyes and thought about New York. He'd been there once with Cabos at the turn of the century, but that was it. Outside of that, and an unconscious trip to Panama in the midst of the Napoleonic Wars, he'd not crossed into what he still considered the New World. He sighed. Machiel, Francis will ensure your transfer in London, and Marcus has already made arrangements for New York. Cabos's voice sounded softly in Michael's head. Has your plane left? Not yet, but I hear the engines have started, and Michael stopped mid-thought. Cabos, will I hear you in America? Can we speak, this so far from each other? Oh, I have communicated with many in America, my child. Still, you and I will not speak. I do go to Haltoran this morning, Machiel, and I will greet the sun. Michael was silent. 670 years, Machiel. It is too long for a man, and no matter what I have become, I was born a man. I will greet the sun and die in Flanders. Father, please. Even in thought, Michael's voice was plaintive. There's too much I must learn from you, too much I must know. There's nothing left to teach you. Sleep now and remember, you must be strong for your journey. Michael felt his eyelids grow heavy. Cabos had done this before when Michael was new, when he still called himself Machiel and still thought of himself as Flemish. Michael felt calmness replace anxiety as he fell into slumber. Then, as promised, the remembrance came, and Michael's grief left him and let the images wash over him.